Welcome to The Power of Tax Defense Attorneys, Tax Corner with Juda Gabaie.
Welcome to Breaking Down the IRS Audit Process, Types and Severity Explained with Juda Gabaie. I'm your host, Abigail Vaca, and I'm joined today by Juda Gabaie, expert tax attorney of Gabaie & Associates, LLC. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's jump right in. Juda, can you explain what triggers an IRS audit?
Sure. There are a few ways to trigger an IRS audit. If it's a filed return, then it could be a random audit. That's number one. Number two, it could be a paper audit. A paper audit means that information that was reported on the tax return versus what the IRS has on that individual or business does not match. So that's a paper audit. A paper audit could result into an actual audit, person audit. And then another option is, besides the random audit, the paper audit, there is the option where there are programs out there by the IRS that does these. It's not called a random audit, but it does an audit based on incomes. It does it based on, discrepancies in the tax return itself. So I've seen that happen plenty of times. I've also seen audits happen for federal employees if they're going for a special, license or a secret clearance or something like that. That could happen also. But on a filed return, that's the different types of audits that does happen. In terms of unfiled returns, when you have an unfiled returns, you could be audited too, and that would happen with something called a 6020B. That's a paper audit possibly, or it could be an individual auditor on the side of the case. That is an estimate return. The government is saying you didn't file a return. We're going to file an estimate on your behalf. That could be an option also. So something to take into consideration. That tends to happen. I've also seen audits in filed returns where a individual or business rounded off all their income or expenses. So you'll see like a bunch of zeros after each expense. So that could be, a trigger for an IRS audit.
Are there any other triggers that would be good to know about?
Yes, the IRS is starting to use AI to see what expenses tend to be overstated. Usually the IRS is what triggers an audit with the IRS tends to be, entertainment, food and clothing, entertainment, food, those type of stuff would trigger an audit. Car expenses, those are the number one big audits that tend to happen. And then that would blow up the audit into other areas of the tax return. So usually starts off with the food or entertainment or advertisement, and then it will go into other areas of the tax return.
So you touched on it a little bit. So there are different types of IRS audits. Can you talk about how they differ in terms of process and severity?
For a different paper audit usually tends to be the best audit because there's no auditor on that case. Usually the IRS is addressing one or two issues and that's pretty much it. If you have an actual auditor on the case, the actual auditor will look at a few items, and depending on how well you do on those few items, they may open up other items on the tax return or may even open up other years. They can even go back and open up other years to take a look at it and see if similar situation was done in those years too. Other types of audit is, let's say you have a revenue officer assigned to your case for an outside tax liability, and the revenue officer sees something on your case that doesn't look right. So they could send it in for exam. So that tends to happen. Or if you take certain deduction lines that raises concerns on the IRS system, that at that point you can get assigned a revenue agent to your case to examine those returns or that return.
So how should individuals prepare for an IRS audit?
Individuals can prepare for an IRS audit by start putting all their documents together, the substantiation. When you file a tax return, you should be able to substantiate the expenses and the income on that tax return. The government is usually going to want to see bank statements for proof of income, right? The government is going to want to see expenses. Usually when you want to substantiate an expense, you have a bill or an invoice and you have a payment. So they're going to want to see those two things. Now, if you don't have both of them, it's not a major issue, but it's definitely something that could be addressed with that revenue agent. And then the next and most important thing is, I always tell this to all my potential clients is hiring a tax professional is always in your best interest. Hiring somebody local that may know the field auditors or may know the managers or the IRS or the state auditors, that could definitely help. Auditors for sure prefer to deal with a professional than dealing with the individual taxpayer, because expertise of the individual of the professional, it definitely helps to getting the case to a resolution much quicker.
Got it. So you mentioned bank statements. What other documents and information should be gathered in advance?
So it all depends. If it's a business audit, generally the government wants to take a look at a general ledger. They want to take a look at a profit and loss. They would want to take a look at a balance sheet, trial balances. Those are stuff that they usually want to take a look at. They also usually want to take a look at all the bank statements. Depending if it's a business, they want to see all the business bank accounts, depreciation schedules, car mileage logs. It all depends on what the auditor is requesting. Usually, like I mentioned, usually it'll start on a few points. And if you do well on those points, they'll keep the audit the way it is. But if you don't do well on those few line items, they may look into other line items.
Juda, in your experience, what are the most common mistakes taxpayers make during an IRS audit that can lead to more serious consequences?
So the most serious mistakes that taxpayers make is that either I've seen taxpayers ignore the notice. I've seen taxpayers not provide the auditor with the information that they're requesting, which will only lead to opening up more line items. I've seen taxpayers not understanding how the tax return works and what the line items are. Usually depreciation schedules, those type of stuff could definitely, affect the taxpayer. And so it's essential that, tax professional handle the audit to avoid any of those mistakes that could potentially happen.
All right, let's break it down. Can you explain the role of a tax attorney in an IRS audit?
A tax attorney, first off, gives you attorney-client privilege. So if anything, if there's anything on the tax return that may not look accurate, the taxpayer can explain that to the attorney. At that point, the attorney can work with the auditor to determine, okay, how do we address this? How do we fix this up? And how do we keep this audit as a civil matter and not let it turn into a criminal issue? And generally, as an attorney, our goal is to try to get the taxpayer's audit into a favorable resolution. And that all depends on how the audit is going, what the IRS is seeking, and what information there is that the taxpayer has that can provide to the attorney to try to bring this audit to a successful resolution.
So what can you do as an attorney to help mitigate the outcome and protect the taxpayer's interests?
What we could do as an attorney is explain to the auditor the positions that taxpayer took on their tax returns and what was those reasons and what was the reason that the taxpayer or the taxpayer accountant did that for. And usually, we'll put a compelling reason as to why the taxpayer believes that the position that they took should be correct. And that's something, it varies from one taxpayer to another taxpayer. But once we start working on an audit, we will be talking with the taxpayers and discussing, what's the best approach to getting this audit resolved.
So how do IRS audits affect a taxpayer's financial situation in terms of penalties, interest, or potential criminal charges even?
It all depends on how the audit goes, right? If there is a tax deficiency at the end of the audit, then there are penalties. There's different types of penalties, right? There's accuracy related penalty. It could be the negligence penalty. There could be the fraud penalty. There are interests that the government will collect, and that accrues daily. The interest will accrue from when the tax liability was owed. Depending on how severe the case is or how large the tax deficiency is, it could potentially turn into a criminal aspect. It all depends on the criminal side, because for that, you would have to have a criminal investigator, CI, take a look into that also to determine whether it was willful, and there are different elements that would need to be established in order for the criminal aspect to be considered by the IRS.
And for taxpayers who are facing the possibility of an IRS audit, what advice would you give them to ensure the best possible outcome?
The best advice that I would give them is put all your documents together. Reach out to a tax attorney so you're protected. You have attorney-client privilege. At that point, the tax attorney will schedule time to meet with the auditor. Once the attorney meets with the auditor, they will have a guideline of what the auditor is looking for, what is the auditor seeking, and what's the reason for the audit. And then at that point, the taxpayer and the attorney will work together to provide information sufficient to bring the audit to a closure. The goal is always to bring the audit to the closure and not let it expand to other line items or other tax years. But that should be usually the main goal, is to try to bring that examination to a closure.
So a proactive approach.
Yes, a proactive approach is the most important.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with me today. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
Thank you for listening to Breaking Down the IRS Audit Process, Types and Severity Explained. To connect with Juda, visit reliabletaxattorney.com. And don't forget to leave us a comment, like, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to the podcast. We love hearing from you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.